Biden's agenda as we go forward. He is someone who has put forward a really ambitious early childhood agenda. And so I have been really looking forward to this conversation. As I mentioned, three of the people whose voices I value very much wanted to invite into this conversation today. That is Katie Ham, Vice President for Early Childhood Policy at the Center for American Progress, Sarah Ritling, the Executive Director of the First 5 Years Fund, and C. Mary James, who is the Interim President of the National Black Child Development Institute. We're so glad to have all three of you with us. There are lots of different dimensions of this that we could sort of explore over the next hour, and I do want to invite those of you who may have questions for panelists. Please go ahead and put those into the chat, and a little bit later in the hour we'll pose some of your questions to the panel as well. But I thought we'd start big picture with just sort of what does it all mean? Was this year a win for young kids, and what might we expect going forward into 2021? Katie, maybe we start with you.
Yeah, I think when we look at the big picture, we see rising COVID case levels. We see a growing eviction crisis. We see unprecedented levels of food insecurity in households with children. And we know that babies, those children under 1, are the most likely to be poor in this country. We know that Black children of immigrants, have been especially harmed by policies that perpetuate economic inequality, racial inequality, anti-immigrant policies. So it's hard to look at this past year and say that it has been a good year for young children, given everything that is going on in our country. I think, in the election, I think we do have some good news. There are many policies that the Trump administration put forward and implemented that were really, really harmful for young children, especially children of immigrants, especially Black children, who really bore the brunt of some of those policies, undermining the social safety net, programs that provide basic needs like nutrition and housing. We've seen a lot of that for the past 4 years. So I do have hope with a new president, a new administration that really wants to get the country back on track going into January. We also saw in the election that our country is really still divided. There is hyper-partisanship in this country. A lot of people came out and voted for Joe Biden. A lot of people came out and voted for Donald Trump. So it's certainly not going to be easy to push through any kind of legislation or agenda. I think that remains an uphill battle. But I do think we have an administration coming in that has proposed the most ambitious agenda for young children that we've really ever seen, from expanding home visiting, expanding childcare, looking at healthcare supports for young children, family supports writ large. So I personally have a lot of hope, but understand also the reality that we are coming from a place where there is a lot of work to do to set this country in the right direction for young children.
Sarah, why don't we turn to you and let you kind of weigh in on the same question? What did the election mean for young kids from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thank you for having me. I obviously agree with everything that Katie said in terms of where we are as a country, both in terms of the division, but more importantly, the issues that children are facing for a host of reasons. And so I think there's a lot of work to do, as Katie pointed out. From the election, I think one of the things that I've been leaning on and looking at analysis is that voters were looking for competence and also some moderation. And so in thinking about where we are as a country coming out of the election, as Katie pointed out, the division, and there's a lot of things that can divide us. But on the optimistic side, this is certainly an issue that can unite us as it affects children of red, blue, purple, all political arms. I think the competence issue in looking at how voters came out, voters don't necessarily go to the polls because of where candidates are on childcare or early childhood education, but they certainly want a better tomorrow for their children. And I think in looking for competence, particularly at the top of the ticket, going forward, is something that we really have an opportunity to lean in on as we go forward. So I think that's tremendous. Looking at we'll get into this probably a little bit more, but I think looking at the political makeup of Congress, there's a lot of elected officials who, particularly on the Republican side, who didn't necessarily think they would be back here in 2021, and really elevated and used and talked about and put their names on hard votes because of what they were seeing and hearing in their districts. And I think that presents a real opportunity going forward as well. So I agree with the division and the hardship. I'm going to end as Katie did on the optimistic side and look forward to talking more about that as we go forward. Thanks.
Great. Samara, you're muted.
Thank you for inviting me to unmute. So yes, I'm going to agree, of course, with Sarah and Katie that it was a good month, that there was positive progress for children and families. With the new administration entering the White House, as Katie said, a strong plan around early education, around home visiting, that is comprehensive. But I would like to say there's a lot of work to do. The shock of COVID-19 to our early childhood systems really will cause long-term effects, and we have an administration that has a lot of work to do, and a Congress that has a lot of work to do with the cost of care, the cost of early education increasing, with so many children being kept home, being out of care, losing that continuity of care with caregivers, the impact on social emotional skills because they're not alongside their peers learning as much as they would have in a typical year. So I think there's a lot of work to do, particularly with the disproportionate effect on Black and communities of color where more centers have closed. So as I look hopefully into 2021, I want to ensure that we're thoughtful about the amount of work that we have to do globally. As Sarah said, folks coming out to vote, they're not just thinking about childcare, but they are thinking about more globally what's better for their children. There's a lot of work that we have to do to address hunger. There's a lot of work that we have to do to address now many more childcare deserts in communities of color. But I do have a lot of hope based on how the election turned out.
Great. Thanks, Samara. And, Sarah mentioned that, parents may not be voting based on this particular set of issues, but maybe those in attendance today are a little bit more closely attuned to the intricacies of the early childhood policies. Katie, you mentioned that President-elect Biden has, from your perspective, the kind of the most ambitious early childhood and caregiving plan that we've seen in quite some time. I wonder, and this, we can certainly open this up. Katie is not a representative of the campaign, but I suspect knows a few of the details. Could you share a little bit about, for the audience, about what is involved in President-elect Biden's caregiving plan that we might look forward to?
Sure. So it's a pretty comprehensive approach to childcare and early education. For childcare, the president-elect has proposed that most families with a child under 5 would receive childcare assistance. He has said that he supports something like what Senator Murray and Representative Bobby Scott have introduced in the Childcare for Working Families Act, which would mean an increase in wages so that childcare providers earn a minimum of a living wage, and there's pay equity if they have the same experience and credentials as teachers in our K-12 system have. It would make big improvements in quality options for parents. It would address some supply issues, and it would limit what families pay for childcare to 7% of their household income, regardless of how many children they have. So for a typical family, this would mean they would pay about $45 a week for childcare. So we're talking huge, systematic, comprehensive reform for 0 to 5 childcare. He's also proposed universal preschool for 3 and 4-year-olds in a mixed delivery system. So that would include childcare centers, other childcare providers, Head Start, public schools, all being part of that preschool system. He's proposed expanding childcare assistance for children who are school age, who need summer care, weekend care, off hours care. And he would expand early Head Start childcare partnerships and home visiting and build more of a support network for families. So in pediatrician offices and community health centers, there would be a child development expert who was there to help parents who are kind of navigating parenting and child development and making sure that that social support is there. I'm sure I'm leaving something out because it is a really well thought out and comprehensive plan that I'm super excited about. And Sarah and Samir should feel free to add anything.
Anything either of you would add on that note?
That was comprehensive from my perspective, yeah.
Well, Sarah, let me turn to you then, because we talked about how ambitious this is. We also know that as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, Congress is currently split, and may or may not continue to stay that way. Even if it does, flip, it will be a very close. Kind of narrow margins in both chambers, really. The First 5 Years Fund, though, in recent years has done some amazing polling that really looks at voters' attitudes toward early childhood. And I think, in a nutshell, and I want to ask you to expand on it, but, in a nutshell, what it shows is that there is a very widespread bipartisan support for these issues. So I guess my question to you, Sarah, is first, can you expand a little bit on what some of those results have been, and then looking ahead, toward the Congress for 2021, do we have a hope that maybe this is a place that Congress could find some bipartisan agreement, even if Congress remains divided?
Yeah, no, thank you. I really appreciate that question, and I'm happy to start with kind of what we found in polling over a number of years, and felt each year within the context of the elections or what's happening, make some alterations to test where voters are. And what we found, a couple key statistics, I guess, this year, that the majority of voters, particularly 82% of women, found that childcare, because of COVID, have seen that that childcare is essential. I think this is a critical statistic going forward, something that honestly, I don't want to say we couldn't have done it without the pandemic, but certainly the pandemic has helped to really show how critical childcare is, and those polling numbers help to show that, particularly as we're seeing over 50% of women leaving the workforce to care for their children. This 82% number, particularly of women, is not hopefully surprising. There's a direct connection to the economy in that regard. Year to year, we've tested to see where voters are. Should the federal government, frankly, be increasing the investment? So looking at the amount of money going into birth through 5, and there's year to year, very high percentage across party lines who believe that actually Congress should be doing more, over half. So you could say, continue doing the same, do you do more? 77% of voters and over 60% of Republicans, and this is an interesting question. If we were to say that the care and education of children is publicly funded from kindergarten and beyond, should this be the same for younger children? Essentially asking if the care and education of children birth through 5 is a public good, and 77% did agree that in fact was the case. And then I think this is where I'm going to jump off, and we have all the statistics you can dig into on our website, but 83% of voters believe that their elected officials should be doing more and have a plan. And this is where I would tie back directly to what Katie said, in that the president-elect has a comprehensive plan, birth through 5, to look at all aspects of what needs to happen. We've taken that and looked at where Congress is currently. There's over 250 early childhood or early care and education bills introduced. 88 of those are bipartisan. We've crosswalked that with elements of the Biden-Harris plan. And listen, there's lots of opportunity with respect to the both awareness level, the public perception, and what they're asking of their elected officials, and then also the ability of particularly this incoming president to know how Congress works and what you need to do with Congress to get something done. We believe deeply in bipartisanship. We have lots of evidence to show the issue is bipartisan, but it's not a throwaway line. It really is to show that something can happen. We can fight over a lot of issues in this country. There's no lack of that. We can certainly do that. This is not one of them. If this president is coming in to be America's president, this is the issue that he can do that. And there is a Congress that's willing to step up. We see that currently in COVID relief. We believe they should be doing more in this bipartisan package, but it's certainly throughout this COVID process of Congress negotiating different versions of relief. Childcare has been included in every single one. From all aspects of Congress. And so, really picking up on where that is and looking particularly in the near term, in the first quarter of the next Congress and administration, but certainly in the next 2 to 4 years, there's no lack of opportunity in my mind.
That's great, Katie. And Samara, I want to give you the opportunity to sort of weigh in on that same topic. I mean, as you look into the crystal ball for the coming year, I mean, is this a place where you see some opportunity for agreement?
Oh, absolutely. I see opportunity for agreement, but I also want to focus on an opportunity for accountability as well, that we have some accountability on a definition of quality and progress that's equitable, where we're thinking about how we push the ball forward in a way that will be equitable for communities of color as well. I think we have had a definition of quality where we're starting to expand it. We're starting to talk about, is this quality if we don't have a diverse workforce? Is it quality if we have folks in our workforce that do not receive equal pay, and there are disparities by race and pay in our workforce? So we're having that conversation. What I'd like to see is more of that conversation showing up in legislation, in what we see from the administration in the coming year. So again, while I'm very hopeful, and I think there's a unifying conversation around young children, there's also a need to even challenge the way that we talk about it, so that we weave equity into the conversation much more comprehensively.
Good. I want to come back to you on the equity question in just a minute, but Katie, anything you would add on the question of bipartisanship?
So, I think we're in this weird moment where I have never seen so many news articles. I've never seen so many people who are outside of the early childhood advocacy in the field and early childhood delivery talking about childcare, talking about how it's essential, how we need it for economic growth and recovery, and really recognizing that as a truth. But we have not seen, and we hear it from Congress too, we hear the lip service, but we haven't actually seen them pass something that delivers meaningful relief to this sector that has been holding us all together for the past 9 months through this pandemic. So I am hopeful, but I'm also, they got to get it across the finish line. Bipartisan discussion, bipartisan bills, it doesn't matter if they can't pass something. And I think, there's this bipartisan bill being debated in Congress right now. It has $10 billion for childcare, which is below where McConnell was in his skinny bill that was a third of the size. He found $15 billion childcare. So I think it is, as Samir said, it is about accountability, that we're not just looking for lip service, we are looking for funding, and we are looking for legislation that they can pass together. And I think this whole field is really going to have to pull together to make that happen and pressure our elected officials coming off of the election to make sure that what they talked about during their campaigns is actually something that we see in Congress in the next 6 months.
Well said. So Mary, I wanted to come back to you on the question of equity. Other than COVID, one of the primary focus areas of maybe of the past year really has been racial justice, and really, I think the murder of George Floyd set off a giant discussion in the country about justice and equity. From your perspective at MBCDI, are you feeling optimistic on the equity front looking into next year that some of these proposals, if passed, will help to make for more equitable early childhood systems across the country?
So I believe yes, but of course I have a caution with it that a huge part of it is accountability. So I believe yes in that the conversations are happening, that there's more attention in our state level administrators. There's more attention in the way that we are funding. There's more attention across the board. There's more attention, there's more conversation. But I do look at the outcome of the election and think about the fact that there was a message about everyone not being on the same page about a commitment against racism or a commitment to take a different approach as a country around racial justice. So that is a huge caution for me, but a call to action. That means that we have work to do in having this conversation about what it means for our young children. If we really use this moment to get this right, we have an opportunity to change things, to change the future for all children so that the country looks differently. And then the other caution I have is exactly what Katie just said, which is if we're having trouble passing the basic legislation that gets us all back open and running, that ensures that all children have access to high quality early education, then it does make me feel a bit less hopeful that we can then start to discuss and have a strong discourse about the types of legislation that's going to change the early childhood system to be more equitable.
So let's take that question sort of head on at this point. I mean, COVID is the big story of the year, and Katie, I totally agree with your assessment and Sarah's. I think that it's on one hand it's an exciting period, and that we've got childcare providers being sort of lumped into the category of first responders, which hopefully is an elevation to a very special sort of prestige and status in the country. We know how important childcare is, and we are seeing it's if you look through search Google someday and visit the news section on Google, and you will find article after article after article of people now recognizing the importance of childcare and speaking to the importance of why we need to make sure that the industry is sustainable. And yet, I feel like we've been looking at those same articles now for 4 or 5 months, kind of feeling like we've been right on the cusp of some additional COVID relief as these providers are struggling and reporting that they're not going to, make it as solvent businesses very much longer. Sarah and Katie, what is your perspective at this point on where are we with a second round of COVID relief? It seems that something will happen eventually. Is it something, from your point of view, that we're going to see happen during the lame duck session here, maybe before the holidays, or is this something that we're going to be waiting until the Biden administration comes in to really see movement on?
I don't know, Katie, do you? This is, I don't know, this is like the DC parlor game right now, right? I guess there's a lot of it's probably closer than it has been to date. I think the report I read right before logging into this is that there's still significant issues between the negotiators around liability reform. So, there's just things that are holding up movement, I think. But, child care, to Katie's point, needs to change in that plan. The fact that it's in there with things like, money to go to hospitals, food insecurity, rent, all of those things. This is what Congress is holding up. I mean, to think that they would head into the holidays without providing, and the darkest hours of what's to come in COVID, even though there is light at the end of the tunnel, it's awful. It's terrible. So, I think my point is there's a lot of things that are affecting this process that are bigger or different, I would say, than childcare. And we can continue to pick away at our issue, but whether or not Congress, does what they should do before they leave town is we thought that they should have done that in July, and they did. So I want to be optimistic and hopeful, but we have to prepare for every scenario in this regard. And whether you're a restaurant owner or you're an ER doctor, or you're trying to figure out where you're going to get food tomorrow to feed your family, like it's tragic. Sorry. I feel very strongly about their inability to get this done.
I would echo the frustration. The way that childcare providers have been treated during this pandemic is shameful. The fact that we're 9 months in and we haven't seen a meaningful investment in childcare. We saw Delta Airlines get more than the entire childcare sector. It is completely shameful. And we hear people talking about essential workers, but that doesn't pay the rent, that doesn't pay the insurance, that doesn't pay providers who are caring for children of essential workers and parents who have to go back to work. Our economy will not recover if we don't save childcare. Last night, I read about 2 programs shutting their door, just last night. And they're selling all of their things. They are giving up their building. They are firing their employees. They are not coming back. They are gone. And if we didn't have enough childcare in this country to begin with, if we think that we can recover vaccine or no vaccine without saving the childcare industry, we have another thing coming. 1/3 of workers are parents. They are not going to be able to return to the office if we don't have childcare and if we've just let those businesses go under. And I think it ties back to what Samir was saying. It's not a coincidence that Delta Airlines got more than the childcare sector. This is work that is disproportionately performed by Black women and by brown women who have been undervalued. Their work has been undervalued in this country. They have not ever gotten the wages that they deserve. They didn't get access to the payment protection program and other loans that other businesses got. It is by design. It is taken for granted. And I don't even know what to say when we're fighting to get back to Mitch McConnell's number. It's ridiculous. And as parents, as childcare providers, as advocates, we should not stand for it. I mean, it's not acceptable for these folks to go home and not put real money into the pockets of providers. And when they come home, I hope everyone lets them know that.
Absolutely. Interesting question in the chat from Liz in North Carolina. She's asking, how do you think this conversation might be different had President Trump won the election? She's saying, I suspect it would be more about what we can do without federal help, and should we still be having those kinds of conversations given what may be a divided government? And frankly, to Sarah and Katie, to your points and frustrations here, no secret that this has been a major need now for many, many months, that the small businesses and many people's livelihoods are on the line. So I guess I would add on to Liz's question, I guess if the alternative is, if we're going to rely maybe less on looking to the federal government, do the states need to step in here and play a role in recognition right now that even something as seemingly simple as COVID relief has been very hard to advance here recently.
I mean, I guess the hurdle in that is assuming that states and local governments have the funding to be able to do that. I mean, this is kind of the crux of it all, right? There is a lack of leadership on this right now. I can't begin to explain or understand the Trump factor in any of this. I don't think, whatever that is, but hopefully at least having the election over, I mean, we're here having a different conversation. And I think, we're also here having a more optimistic conversation about what's to come should we be able to get through this. And so, there's that. And with respect to childcare, in early negotiations, though, the president wasn't necessarily the one negotiating, but Secretary Mnuchin did have, in some of his early proposals, $25 billion on the table at one point. So again, all it does is point to the recognition that not necessarily the reality of what's getting done, but certainly does point to the recognition.
I agree about we can't rely on the states. States have already spoken up and said, we're struggling, we need the federal help on a number of issues, but this issue in particular, hunger and housing included. And so it would be great to say, yes, the federal government's not the answer, let's turn to state governments. But our state governments have also carried the weight of responding to COVID-19. They've carried the weight of responding to housing crises. They've carried the weight of responding to the closure of businesses. And so there's not a good option. We were shocked in August that August recess happened without action, and to be here thinking about going into the holidays without action is appalling. I remember in June there being a call from a collection of state attorney generals for there to be action taken around childcare in June, and we thought, oh, this push, this group is going to get it done. And it just hasn't been, and there's been plenty of lip service, but it's not happening.
Katie, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think states are strapped. We did see in the election some ballot initiatives affirming voters' preferences to spend taxpayer money, whether that was through excise taxes or continuing existing programs. We did see strong feedback from voters, and I think 8 communities around the country, that they want to see funding for early childhood. So I think that bodes well. I think more governors and mayors can use the bully pulpit to call on the federal government to invest in childcare and early education. I do think that members care when the governors of their states are asking for resources. So I think it's more about putting pressure on federal elected officials. I also think, Republicans have to have something to show they have folks up for reelection in 2022. They have to have something to show for these 2 years other than being obstructionists. So I'm hoping that can translate into some funding. I mean, the federal government really does have to be the funder of these programs, especially right now. And we saw the biggest increase in the Child Care and Development Block Grant under the Trump administration, much to everyone's surprise, because Schumer and McConnell were able to cut a deal. So we still, even in a divided Congress, even if there is Republican control in the Senate or a very kind of narrow margin for Democrats that includes some conservative members of their caucus, I still think there's room for deal making, but I do think it's going to have to be the federal government sending money to states and communities.
Definitely. Want to encourage those of you who are watching, if you have questions for our panel, please include them and go ahead and type them right in the Q&A. I mentioned the chat earlier. Sounds like the chat may be disabled, but the Q&A is not. So please do enter your questions, and we'll try to get to those as well. One of the things I wanted to pose to all three of you, the CARES Act dollars that went out to states through the Child Care and Development Block Grant were administered in a way, at least, that gave the state some flexibility to take care of providers' needs in particular and families' needs during this unusual time, and did appear to lead to at least some innovation. Some of those things that they needed to request waivers for potentially from the Office of Child Care, but in many cases just things that that maybe they've had the power to do. For example, contracting by classroom, or looking at enrollment versus attendance in terms of paying out to really cover the full cost of quality. The Biden campaign slogan has been very much around building back better. Are there innovations that you see that have sort of come out of this past year that you think might wisely live beyond the pandemic?
Yeah, I think a lot of the policies that make sense during the pandemic would have made sense before and will make sense after. So, we've seen childcare really be pushed to the brink. We haven't seen that necessarily be the case in other publicly funded programs like Head Start. We've even heard from childcare providers that the early Head Start childcare partnership money really helped them stay afloat during the pandemic. So having that public money supporting early education really makes a big difference. So policies like paying for enrollment, not attendance, increasing provider wages, increasing overall reimbursement rates. Some states did try to provide more access to health insurance. All of those things are policies that we should have all the time. And I think if there is additional federal dollars, states do have an opportunity to provide proof points to the federal government by showing how those policies can stabilize the industry that frankly we want to do. We don't want to just kind of bounce from crisis to crisis. Now that we maybe all understand how important this sector is, ideally we are putting those policies in place so the sector is not as vulnerable when the next inevitable crisis comes about.
Yeah, I agree with Katie. I sure hope so. There's a host of things that we've learned, but also the things that she highlighted, as well as, supporting these as businesses, the mixed delivery as a business, and how the system really failed, as you pointed out. I think the other piece of it, though, is, I think obviously picking up on that is critical. But, back to what we were saying early, it's also, though, really keeping quality at the forefront, because we do know what works for children in these years, and so making sure that quality piece is stable and in place as we go forward as well.
I would say, in addition to those specific ideas that came out, I think a broader interest in hearing from families and children, from our elected officials, from the media. The rapid survey from University of Oregon is one example. The work of First 5 Years Fund, I feel like there's been more openness to hear about the experiences and the challenges that our educators and that our families are experiencing it. And it's been lip service. We haven't seen the action come from it yet, but I think that there's been a closer ear to the ground on the experiences of our families. And that has been very much been heartening, and something that I hope it's something we put a pin in, but something that we continue. And our local advocates being ensuring that they're raising their voice up at the federal level has been something that's been heartening as well.
Definitely. Let's pull from some of the audience questions here, and please do, if you have one, feel free to enter it into the Q&A. Sharon asks, how can we begin advocating to support the profession as far as increases in pay for childcare teachers? We know, obviously, that those have been very inequitable and very challenging for the early childhood workforce. So how do we advocate in terms of an increase in pay and also for increases in the types of education that childcare teachers might really need?
I'm happy to start. I think there are a lot of ways, both from a movement building perspective and from a policy perspective. So I think there are a lot of policies on the table from President-elect Biden, from leaders in Congress that would serve that purpose. So one is providing wage parity with K-12 teachers, putting in wage floors. The SEIU and other labor unions have this model around wage boards where there is negotiation between workers, labor representatives, industry leaders, and government to come up with a wage schedule. So I think that's one. I think unions in general and professional organizations can be a way for people to be part of a larger policy effort and movement. So organizations like NEYC, the National Association for Family Child Care, labor unions like SEIU and the American Federation of Teachers, I think can be a really great way for providers to connect with one another and start kind of engaging in advocacy, meeting with others in their community so that they can be going to their local, state, and federal elected leaders to promote policies that do promote higher wages. I think that there's also this false notion out there that because childcare costs so much, that providers and workers must be making a decent living. And so I think the more people are able to make themselves vulnerable and talk about what it is really like when you are paid $12 an hour to do this really important work, people entrust you with their children, their most precious resources, and you're paid a poverty level wage. So the more people who can speak up, who are willing to talk to folks in the media, talk at events, talk to members of Congress, and really, I know it's not easy to talk about your finances and your family and how you're impacted, but I do think that really helps if you're able to do that.
And I think to that point, Katie, we're in this moment of more willingness to listen. That I feel a bit more compassion, even if it feels very partisan. There's still a more of a moment of compassion when we're having these conversations about COVID-19 and racial justice. There's much more compassion and a willingness to listen if we are willing to really be vulnerable and talk about what the field looks like when it comes to pay. In terms of types of education, I actually would echo that fact that professional organizations, organizations like Child Care Everywhere are providing a lot of opportunities for professional development. What we need is a connection to that in degrees. So you've seen it out of Washington State, where the credentials and the professional development that you're getting from community-based sources can be used, or they're at least having the conversation about those credentials and that professional development being used towards a degree program, and how you ensure that there's a connection across, because we know that the community-based professional development that our sector is getting, that makes it more accessible, that makes professional development, professional growth more accessible in communities of color. We just need to ensure that we have that conversation about it doesn't always have to take place in a university setting that is usually outside of the community. And that is one way to really push forward that conversation about how we increase access to professional development and raise the level of education in our field.
Interesting follow-up question sort of on this question of pay parity in the chat that I want to give you all a chance to sort of weigh in on. Elizabeth asks, when we do reach equal pay between preschool teachers and K-12 teachers, where would the money come from to pay those wages? And she notes that that families would need to pay twice what they pay now. I'll weigh in to the extent to which to say that I think that Elizabeth, that question makes great sense. I think looking at childcare under its existing model, but I think likely we're looking toward a future where maybe childcare, for example, is looked at as a public good. I don't think I've heard in policy conversations, at least, anyone suggesting that that parents would underwrite that. In fact, I think there's a pretty widespread recognition that parents, almost literally can't pay more than they are paying currently. Anybody want to weigh in and expand on that a bit?
It's absolutely right. The foundation of Build Back Better, when I hear Build Back Better, when NBCDI says rebuild better, we're talking about more public investment in the field, not passing on those costs to families. Our families can't take it anymore, as Dan said. And we know that during this time of high unemployment, where the economy is in such a fragile state, we are absolutely not suggesting that we can ask more from families. we need our elected officials to step up, and we need to see childcare differently. We've already talked about the surveys that are saying communities, our voters, are in support of more public investment in the early childhood field. So it is a re-envisioning, it's building the system back in a completely different way that would allow for those increased wages.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I think Samir covered it really well. It'd be public money.
So another question, we talked a little bit about how ambitious President-elect Biden's plan is. A question from Catherine: is there anything that you feel is lacking in President-elect Biden's plan? I think that presumes in some way that that we will even get everything that is in President-elect Biden's plan. But is there any place any of you feel like maybe not as a specific criticism of the Biden plan, but are there places that you feel like maybe not enough attention is yet being paid in the field?
I will say I would love the opportunity to be able to figure that out when he gets here and we're talking about how to get this plan done. Let's get there and then see what else needs to happen. So I think we need to get to a point where we're having this conversation and really working together, as Katie said, to move some of it forward.
Question here about mixed delivery and about the inclusion of family childcare businesses. What have been the particular issues with that part of the industry, and how are they addressed in the plans being considered at the federal level? Anybody have insights as to what the proposed participation of family childcare would be under the Biden plan?
Yeah, so within the Child Care for Working Families Act, which exists in legislation, and President-elect Biden has said he is supportive of. I mean, family child care is very much affirmatively included as a service delivery mechanism for childcare. Families would be selecting the childcare provider for their child, just as they do now. And then that provider would receive a payment from the family and then a payment from the government. With preschool, we campaign plans are not particularly specific just because they're designed for a very broad audience. So President-elect Biden has said that family childcare is part of the vision for mixed delivery. I don't think we know exactly what that looks like, or really, a lot of specifics around the universal preschool program that he envisions. But I do know that I've definitely heard that in other parts of the country where there have been preschool efforts, it's been really important for family child care to be part of that, both so that those providers can continue to afford to operate and we don't undermine their ability to exist, but also because some families want a setting where their siblings are together, they want something in their neighborhood, they want a provider who speaks their family's home language, who shares their culture, and so it's important that those providers are part of how we envision the system. I do think we'll need to get kind of creative about it, and I personally would love to hear from family childcare providers especially, as to what that could look like. I think a lot of national organizations would like to really learn from them.
Right. While we're we've been talking a lot about what the federal government might do here over the coming year, and I got the questions are scrolling here. The one I was going to read just popped off the screen. So, question about child care subsidies under CCDBG, and what might be done to ensure that states provide adequate subsidies to really increase low-income families' access to high-quality care. Obviously, that is the requirements there. Currently relate to a market survey and an expectation that states reach at least a certain percentage of the market survey in communities. But we also know well that in many states, subsidy rates are on the very low end related to those market surveys. Anyone have thoughts on what we might do to help better enforce that at the state level?
I think it's like we've already said, that childcare is having this moment of attention, is having this moment where parents are speaking up, where there's media attention. And so as advocates, I think it's up to us to ensure that we bring those voices to elected officials, and that we have some accountability and really talk about how our economy, at the state level, our economy is just not going to move forward without childcare, how we need to think of it as a foundation, and using our voices as much as possible will be, that's our secret key. That is what we must do. A combination of using our voices, but then also throwing our voices into the ring with the progress that we've already made in getting elected officials to listen.
Sarah, a question in the chat that may be a good one for you. I know you've been watching Congress carefully. Jerry is asking, who will be the leading advocates on the Republican side of the aisle for better support of early childhood in the upcoming Congress?
That's a great question, and we hope there's many. On the House side, we've seen a number of folks step forward over the course of COVID, and actually early on in appropriations before March, before the pandemic. Folks like John Katko, there's Tom Cole of Oklahoma, who chairs appropriations. Rodney Davis from Illinois. There's 18 members, Republican members, who voted in favor of the $57 billion number in COVID. So to earlier points about holding people accountable for their votes, and certainly for the issue going forward, those are some key top targets, honestly. On the Senate side, I think we're looking obviously both at, from a numbers game on election side. So folks should Loeffler make it back to Congress. She put her name out there, as did Joni Ernst in a significant way, who's now back. And so what does that mean for her in the next six years with the freedom of not having an election coming down the pike? We're losing Senator Alexander, but certainly if Senator Burr were to take up that position, it'd be interesting. He's had a lot of experience in the issue in the past. And then, looking at 2022 and what Republican senators are up, and looking at what we need to do to build some leadership there. I know I'm leaving folks off of the list, but listen, this is building a bench of Republican support so that folks like Patty Murray and Rosa DeLauro can do what they do, and Catherine Clark and Elizabeth Warren, and stepping up, and a lot of the Democrats who've been leading on this issue for a long time, but getting them some support. And I think this new bipartisan group, the 908 Coalition, as they're calling themselves, presents some interesting opportunity, considering that you referenced those slim margins early on. To get things through the Senate, you need to bring everybody along from Manchin, who's a fairly conservative Democrat from West Virginia, all the way to Bernie Sanders. And then some Republicans. So we have to look at a lot of support.
Katie, Samara, anything you'd add on the Republican side?
I have the same kind of list in mind as well, and would echo what Sarah said, that we're excited to learn about the new bench that's coming in. They've certainly had the importance of children in their discourse. I haven't seen specific plans from them that make me really excited, but that doesn't mean that there isn't great things to come.
Yeah, and I think
that accountability thing we were talking about.
I think there are themes that work across the Senate. I think a lot of senators are concerned about rural issues because all of their states include rural areas where there's not enough childcare. There's concern about business and concern about recovery. So the more that we can harp on those themes, I think the better off we'll be in garnering support across the board.
Great. We have, unfortunately, just a couple minutes left. The hour has sort of flown by. I wanted to wrap up today by giving you each a quick opportunity to respond to one final question, and that is, what is your greatest hope from an early childhood policy perspective as we head into 2021. Katie, you want to start?
Sure. My hope is that early in the next administration, as part of a recovery package, we don't just put the Band-Aid on childcare with the relief or stabilization dollars, that we get a robust sum of money that really can reform the system, that makes it affordable, that increases wages, that provides more quality option and more supply for families.
So just a little hope. So Mary, let's turn to you.
I hope that we recognize the disproportionate impact of COVID-19, and that when we get that funding to reform the system, that we ensure that there is a focus on community of color with those resources.
And Sarah, will give you the last word.
Yeah, well, obviously I agree. I agree with all of that. And I guess my greatest hope is that all of us who have been living through this, and I mean everybody, not just the advocates who do this every day, or the providers who do it every day, but that really this becomes a national conversation that's driving towards solutions so that we can get all of those things done. We can't just go back into our, we'll figure it out as a family, but really make it a national conversation so that our elected officials can do everything that my colleague said.
Well, I want to thank each of you for being here. I have to say, when we thought this session up a couple months back and started putting some thought to it, truly, I thought, who are the three people I'd love to kind of hear from most on this topic? And I was so glad that you could all participate today. It's been a great conversation, and we're just so grateful for your time. Katie Ham, Vice President of Early Childhood Policy for the Center for American Progress, Sarah Rittling, Executive Director of the First 5 Years Fund, and Samari James, Interim President of the National Black Child Development Institute. Thank you all for being here with us today. And I do want to mention one more. Let's see if we can get the slide to advance here. Here we go. This is actually our last Early Efforts webinar for the calendar year. So the last time we will be together for a couple of weeks. Want to wish everybody a safe and happy holiday season. And I want to invite you to join us back for our next edition in early 2021. We'll be together on Thursday, January 7th at 2 p.m. Eastern to talk about the science of early learning and its implications for policymakers. We'll be joined by Ellen Galinsky, Chief Science Officer at the Bezos Family Foundation, Dr. Myra Jones-Taylor, Chief Policy Officer at 0 to 3, and Dr. Patricia Kuhl of the University of Washington's Institute for Learning and Brain Science. So hope that you will take a moment to register for that so you don't forget over the holidays. Go ahead and get that one on your calendar. And we will look forward to seeing you again in 2021. Again, thanks to our panel, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Have a good afternoon.